What would it be like to walk into the woods with nothing but the clothes on my back and walk out with a deadly bow and arrow? Well, recently found out. So when the bow and arrow was first invented around 60,000 years ago in Africa, it was peak technology of humans. And for a Paleolithic craftsman, it would be their most valued and laborious product. And this set took me over 40 hours of nonstop work to make, and it's about the easiest good bow that one can make. I wanted to make a time-tested, efficient design. So I studied the historical methods of the indigenous peoples in my area, such as the Apache and the Comanche, and drew on over a decade of my experience as an ethno-botanist, archer, and flint knapper to make this bow and arrow in a way virtually identical to how it may have been done in this same spot thousands of years ago. It combines many different natural materials and tools, all gathered and worked within walking distance from where I sleep every night. Perhaps no one has done this here in hundreds of years, but it's interesting to think that before that, for millennia, probably most people knew how to do this long and complex process. The practice that sustained humans for 2,400 generations is now simply a curiosity that you can see in this video. So I did choose a simple, small bow, somewhat weak-powered, using just a branch, primarily all to save time. But for that reason, it may be rather common historically, especially in arid regions where large trees good for bow wood are scarce. Paleolithic bow and arrow technology did develop into an incredible fine art, especially in periods and times of abundance, such as the Neolithic southeastern U.S. In fact, the indigenous people were said by the first Spanish expedition in 1540 to be able to fire an arrow completely through a tree trunk or an entire horse lengthways or several coats of Spanish mail. And they achieved these feats using large self-bows of oak, perhaps also hickory or even Osage orange. They were reminiscent of the famed English longbow. Now, the Cahuilla on the Texas coast were known to use longbows made from eastern red cedar wood that were precise in aim at 100 yards. And their principal manner of subsistence was fishing with these bows from canoes, using reed arrow shafts and pyramidal bone arrowheads. So mine pales in comparison to these, but it is strong enough to fish and hunt at least small game and perhaps even deer at close range. And it has a very nice, smooth action and an accurate shot, especially if the arrows are well-tuned and matching. And I'll show you exactly how I made it. So the first step is finding a mulberry tree. So the introduced white mulberry is found all over the U.S., especially where people are. And mulberry wood from the native red or Texas mulberry, Morus rubra and Morus microphylla, those were favored by the Apache and Comanche for bow wood, being only second to the famous Osage orange, which is also in the mulberry family. However, mulberry is way softer and easier to carve than Osage orange, and it's much more common. Now, functionally, the white mulberry wood is pretty much identical to native mulberries, and the species actually hybridizes with the red mulberry. A lot of modern bowyers exclusively use wood split from a trunk, but this requires significantly more work, especially if you're doing it all with stone tools. Branch bows were commonly made by natives throughout the U.S., especially in more arid regions, likely because they're easier and you can yield a similar quality bow. Now, branch bows also don't kill the tree, but unlike splitting it from the trunk, you can only get one bow from a branch. So you want to choose a straight unbranched section, and small twig scars, they're kind of hard to avoid. And it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. A bend of an inch or two over several feet is fine. Now, this entire build, I'll be taking wood only from one side of the branch. Any cuts into the wood from the other side will compromise the integrity of the finished bow. So you want to side it down and choose the best half of the branch for the bow and mark that lightly in the bark. And you want to choose a dividing line that's as parallel as possible when drawn on both sides of the branch. And it should follow the grain or the curves. So if you hold the bow as if shooting, you want the curves to go away from you or towards you, but not as much from side to side. And if you can find a branch with curved ends away from you and a straight middle, this is kind of an ideal naturally recurved bow. And it's okay if it curves towards you, is a bit curvy overall. The Apache and Tawnawatham actually recurved their bows' ends by heating them over a fire and bending them. I didn't do that though. But another advantage to the branch bow method is you can carve the wood green. In fact, it's easier to carve green. And with green wood, it's easier to do the split and peel method. So you split open a thin section of the grain with a sharp stone wedge driven in by another stone, and you peel off the long strips by hand. Now with flint, you don't want to hammer directly on it, but you want to soften the blow with a piece of leather or something in between, otherwise you might break the wedge or chips will fly in your eyes and it won't absorb the force fully of the impact. A mallet is also usable. Wedges were historically also made from antler, bone, and other rocks that were ground into shape. My sharp flint wedges also double as draw knives, making it convenient to do draw cuts, and where it stops, hammer it in and split it. So you want to split and peel the wood till almost half is gone, but be careful not to peel into the wood of the other half. It tends to peel easier from the edges more than the core, and from the ends more from the middle. So you'll likely have to stop peeling when you have a good amount of wood left in the middle. You can easily peel the bark with your fingernails if the wood is green. It's excellent since I don't want to damage any of this wood underneath. And I remove the bark when I'm finished with the splitting and the peeling to protect the wood during those processes. Both of those should be done while it's green. It'll be more difficult to peel off the bark outside of the growing season, like in winter, but you can use a flake or something to pry up the bark as long as you're careful. Now, once I've split and peeled all the wood that I safely can, I switch to scraping. And it's okay if it dries out before this stage, but it's not necessary. Now, I use a variety of stone tools, mostly manufactured on site as needed. And I like to have one that's a straight edge, but has a finely chipped or toothed margin made from chipping or pressure flaking the edges carefully. And this fine serration is good for scraping off wood more rapidly as each tooth cuts deeper into the wood. I also have an assortment of flakes with unworked straight edges, and I typically just start breaking a rock and checking the flakes till I find a good one. So if the edge is really thin, it may cut too deeply or get stalled. So a square edge is excellent for consistent, smooth scraping, but it takes longer. And for the most part, I like to use an edge with an angle of about 45 degrees and then switch to the thinner edge for deep cuts and the square edge for smoothing cuts. I also like to have some very small, sharp flakes that are good for working around areas like knots or carefully cutting off ragged wood grain that's impeding even scraping. And these flakes are also good for carving the ends to a point with nocks. Now, flakes with curved edges are also useful for cutting curved surfaces. Scraping is the longest process. The first goal is leveling down the wood to a continuous flat surface in one plane following the grain. So sight down the stave regularly and make sure you're scraping down the high spots. Now, once you've fully removed the wood to leave an equal level half of the stave, the next step is tillering. So tillering is the process of removing wood to make the bow bend in a smooth, even arc. And the majority of the wood removed should be from the flat side. And as you gradually go to the ends of each limb, more wood should be removed. And you can see this visually in the grain of the wood. And you want to remove a bit of the sides to make it taper symmetrically to a point. So you find the middle of the bow, and intermittently, as you scrape, you bend the bow with that point braced, and no areas where it does not smoothly bend, and then scrape wood from those sections. You'll feel the point of resistance in the bend of the bow, and you don't want to force it past that or else you risk breakage. So tillering with stone tools can take a very long time, but at some point you may be satisfied with the arc. It's tempting to try to perfect it and get the deepest, smoothest arc possible, but you can over-tiller it and weaken the bow. Now, modern traditional archers or bowyers typically use a high draw weight, often over 50 pounds, and it's not really necessary, especially for hunting anything smaller than a deer. Indigenous hunters historically typically use a lower draw weight, around 40 pounds, maybe less, and even a 25-pound draw bow can easily take most small game. So once it's satisfactorily tillered, you want to carve the nocks at the tips, no deeper than required to securely hold the bowstring. You can make a comfortable handle using a piece of this same wood. This is actually just the end of this, and wrap it with a thick thong of leather by cutting it out with some buckskin with a very sharp, thin flake. So this bowstring is made from agave leaf fiber, and I cover its complete construction in a recent video. Plant fibers are generally inferior to sinew or gut fibers for bowstrings, but they have advantage over sinew in that they still work in wet conditions. And I did make this primarily as a fishing bow. You don't need to kill a large animal to obtain them, and agave leaves can be sustainably harvested by taking a few here and there from a few different plants. Now, agave or yucca leaves are excellent fiber sources in the South, but other plant fibers historically used for bowstrings by natives in the U.S. include stinging nettle, genus Urtica, dogbane, Apocynon, and milkweed, Asclepias. The Comanche like to use bear gut bowstrings, as they also still work in wet conditions. I couldn't find a bear in the area willing to volunteer, though. The plant fiber bowstrings need to be a wider diameter, so your arrow nocks will need to also be a little bit wide to accommodate them. Now, I cover a complete Stone Age arrow build in another video with feather fletching and stone tips. But I also made these fishing arrows tipped with antler ground into a pyramidal shape, and I'll be publishing a video soon showing how I make these with stone tools. And now I'm sure you want to see this bow in action, so let's check it out.